So here we are once again for our book group on Walter Hilton, The Ladder of Perfection. And this week we're heading towards the end of book one, which is very exciting. But we still got a little bit to do before we get there. So we're looking tonight at chapters 62 to 76, which I hope you've been able to have a look at. I entitled these Rooting Out Sin, and I'm sure you can see why I actually called it by this name. Because in these chapters, Hilton is going to develop his idea of the image, the image. If you remember, we have the image of Christ within the soul, but also we have this image of sin, which is a darkness. And so he's going to really go into what that image looks like. But I want to do a little bit of a recap from last week, because I think getting our heads around Hilton's, I suppose I want to call it pastoral theology, is really crucial, because I think if we can get into that sort of mindset of what he's really talking about, it makes all the language and the images really stand out and also have a sense of real meaning for us. So just to recap, back in chapter 43, he was very keen to describe to us what is the dignity of the soul and how the human soul has a kind of honor and dignity because it is made in the image and the likeness of God. And of course, for Hilton, he sees God in very much in Trinitarian terms. So he sees the nature of God as reflected in the human person through memory, understanding, and will. So when he talks about an image, it's like looking at a kind of image in a mirror. So God is reflected in us, and there is something essential within us that connects us to the Trinity. Man, he says, humanity is made in the image and likeness of the Blessed Trinity. And so I just want to go back and remind you exactly what he says. He says, so man's soul, which may be called a created Trinity, was made complete in the mind, sight, and love of the uncreated and blessed Trinity, who is God. And if you remember last week, we touched a little bit upon the whole notion of, Platonic forms and everything. What is the kind of deep theology behind that? But the bit that I want to really move on to is what happens? What happens? What does Adam do that is essentially destroys that in a sense? And he goes on in the same chapter to say that Adam fell from this blessed Trinity into a vile, dark, and wretched Trinity. That is, into forgetfulness and ignorance of God, and into a debasing and deliberate love of self. So what he's saying now is that somehow the Trinity within us has become blurred, it's become lost. It's like the mirror has got a curtain over the top of it. And instead of looking at the Trinity and seeing ourselves is connected, deeply connected with the Trinity through an image and likeness, we have nothing to look at. And so we just concentrate on ourselves. So then he moved on, if you remember, to talk in chapter 5, that the path of the contemplative really begins in this desire to recover, to some degree, the image and likeness of that dignity which has been lost. And the main reason for this desire to recover is so that the soul may be reformed by grace to a shadow of the image of the Trinity which it once had by nature and will have in heaven. So what's he saying again is that it is the desire of us to recover that dignity, which is actually the key motivator in our reformation, reforming of this sort of darkness into once again seeing within ourselves, within our own dignity, that understanding that we're made in the image and likeness of God. But there's this really sad image, I think, that even if we are reformed by grace to be able to reflect once more, that actually we won't have restored it. We will only have moved towards it. And all that we can get to in this life is a shadow of the image of the Trinity. I suppose it really, for me, it sings of that whole, 1 Corinthians 13. I look in a dark glass, I look in a glass darkly, but then I will see face to face. That's the kind of images that he's sort of bringing here, that even in this life, all we can really restore in ourselves is a shadow of what we will be given, what will be fully restored once we are in heaven. So chapter 46, he then says that what we have to do is seek that dignity, that image which is lost. And the way we seek it is epitomized in the word Jesus. So you're seeking, going into your heart, going into your internal sort of world. And the only way you can find, once again, that shadow of the image, likeness of the Trinity is if you focus on the person of Jesus. And you use that wonderful language of dig for him in love and desires. And don't think about all the other distractions, the sorrows and the fears and the earthly things that might draw your attention, but dig for him and find him. Then he moved on. So I'm skipping on a bit and trying to summarize it all for you here. In chapter 52, he said, then enter into yourself. And if you can, withstand all those barriers that will stop, that will prevent you. Things such as, just being frankly, I can't really be bothered. The sort of spiritual indolence that keeps us all a bit awake. And those vain thoughts, those earthly thoughts, holding Christ in the mind, then you will find something. You see, you'll find not only Jesus as the object of your search, but simply a recollection of his name. So Hilton is trying to show us that even the work we do in this world, we will never restore that image and likeness that we had before the fall in our true nature. That all we can find if we search is a memory, a shadow of what we had when we were in heaven, in Eden, I guess. But the other thing, and this is the crucial bit for tonight, I'm coming on to it, here we go, is that we will also, alongside this recollection of Christ, is we will find a dark and painful image of our own soul, which is neither the light of the knowledge of God nor love and devotion for him. So he's showing us that when we look within, we may have a shadow, we may have a reflection of Christ, but the other thing that's going to dominate our interior world is another vision, another image, and this vision is dark, and it's painful, and it's in our own soul. And he uses the word, the image, if you examine it carefully, is entirely enveloped in a black cloak of sin. The little word sin. And then he goes on to say pride, anger, spiritual indolence, covetousness, gluttony, and lust. That's only 6 of the 7 deadly sins. So he's picked these certain ones. And that's kind of interesting because those are the ones that he's going to explore. So this black shadow, this black image, is replacing the image of Jesus in us. Now, of course, you have to remember that he's talking that the image is not a material thing. It's not of a material form, but it's more like a lack. So it's a bit like when you go into a room, you can see the room, but what happens is the light is turned off. That's kind of what he's meaning. It's not a thing, it's turning the light off so that you can't actually see or comprehend. So maybe it is easier for us to think of this image of darkness not as a darkness in the sense of an image or a kind of a material thing, but rather to see it as a darkened state which springs from our own self-love rather than a reflection or an image of the Trinity. So the image of Christ within us gives us light, whereas the image of sin and darkness, sin gives us darkness and self-love. And so, the image of God is replaced by us as gods. So that's the kind of theology that he's really trying to see as the basis for his writing. The sin is not a state, not a thing, but a state. It's a void which we fill by looking at ourselves. Now, if you remember, he goes on to say that the principal river, this is in chapter 56 now, the principal river of this state is pride, which of course is love, self-love, but it's not just being proud of what you do, saying, oh, that was a good job. It's actually a love of your own excellence. So it's not, so it's not just saying, I've done a good job, that was good, and saying, give God the glory that he's been revealed in that good act, but it's saying, no, I'm really good, I'm so good, and then going around and telling everyone how great you are, that it's all about your own excellence, your reputation, which then leads to having, imagine that you're much holier and you're much better than everyone else, and actually you're the bee's knees and no one else can do it as good as you because you're so wonderful. And then it results in a kind of complacency and a sort of self-satisfaction. And now we come to the chapters that we're looking on tonight. And I wanted to do that preamble because some of the language that he uses in these chapters sort of had their basis back in the chapters beforehand. And it's a kind of continuous piece that he's writing about. So he returns, he says, I want to return to that image of blackness, that image of sin and the principal river of pride. So he really is looking at that void now, that sort of love of self over love of God, and says, we can just say that, oh, I love myself, but what does that really mean? What does it really mean? And this is what he goes on to have a good look at in the next few chapters. He's going to absolutely start defining that for us. What does it look like? And the first one, of course, he's going to look at is pride, because that's seen as the principal river, the big one. And of course, envy and I think is envy and lust, I think, are the two that they are seen as sort of branches. So pride is one that really is really a motivator for other aspects of those sins, which we call these days the seven deadly sins. Now, when you look at this text, when you read this text, it's really helpful to have in your mind who's writing this. So Walter Hilton is writing this, and if you remember, he's an Augustinian canon, and he's writing it for a contemplative, which could be seen as kind of a sort of an elite, kind of religious. But who's actually reading it are ordinary people. So in his work as an Augustinian canon, he has lots of people. He actually works within parishes. So he's working with ordinary people. He probably hears their confessions. He gives them spiritual guidance. He knows their issues. He knows what's going on in their minds. He knows what they have to battle with in their spiritual, but also in their ordinary lives. So this is a parish priest, basically. I know he's living in a community, prayerful community, but he's fundamentally a parish priest. And the traditional place to really deal with this kind of stuff that he's talking about would, of course, be the confessional. Now, it's an interest so in the confessional, that would be where a parish priest would help somebody have the self-awareness to be able to understand what are the kind of things, what are the kind of sins that had actually prevented them in their relationship or walk with God. And I think many of us, particularly possibly Anglicans, we say our confession on a Sunday, but do we actually know what we're confessing? Do we know what it is within us that we're actually saying sorry for? And so when you will go with your confessor was there to help you actually name what were you actually doing? What was the manifestation of pride within your life? Now, for me, it might be I spent 3 hours watching myself on YouTube. Now, my confessor might have said, Emma, I think that's a little bit too much self-love. I'm not sure why don't you just not watch yourself on YouTube or turn it off? Okay. And so that's helping the person absolutely understand how is pride being manifested in their life. That's just a kind of example. But around this period, what's become really interesting is during the 14th century, it's a kind of a culmination of a great history of penance that is developed throughout the ages. So in the 12th century, the 12th century is an amazing kind of period when they really began to think about what is the efficacy of the sacrament of penance? What aspect of penance makes it a sacrament? What aspect of confession makes it a sacrament? So before that, it was very much focused on your contrition. So if I'm really, really, really sorry, I'm really sorry, then it was that God heard, sort of the ringing of the heart, and then would, give you forgiveness for. But increasingly, it wasn't good enough just to say, I'm really, really sorry. You needed to know exactly what you were saying for. So in around this period as well, there was which was the development also of scholasticism. It started thinking through which part of the sacrament of penance is most efficacious. Is it your contrition? Is it your confession when you speak it. So the contrition is the inner work of sort of shame and reflection. Is it the confession when you speak it to a priest? Is it the absolution when the priest lays his hand on you as a kind of act of forgiveness? Or is it the satisfaction, which is the amendment of your life? Now, what the people like Peter Lombard and Gratian, what they came up with was that actually it was not one of these where you can say the actual act of the sacrament of penance happened. There wasn't the one. It was all of it. So what that meant was that your interior reflection, then your exteriorizing of it was really important. Then what your priest said to you and how they helped you more, in speaking it was important. And then finally, you were not going to have the full benefit of God's forgiveness until you'd actually changed your life. So this had a big, big, big kind of effect, and it really flowered in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council, where there was it was decided that everybody, didn't, regardless of whether you felt contrition or whatever, everybody had to make a confession at least once a year. And also there was a very clear 12 marks. There were 12 sort of points which would show that your confession was honest, good, and true. And only if you had these aspects were you going to receive the full benefits of the forgiveness of God. So as you can imagine, this did quite a lot for the ordinary parish priest. First of all, they had to be equipped into how to hear confessions well, but also in preparing people with self-examination, how to actually ensure that the confession that someone gave was full, good, and true, and followed all the 12 marks. And then you had to then put a lot more onus on the poor old penitent who needed to make sure that when they came to the confession, they could first of all know what they were confessing, name it, but also finally name all the things that they had failed in doing and any of the hidden sins that they were unable to confess. So they put a lot more emphasis on how crucial it was for the priest and the penitent to work very closely together so that they were able to give a full, true confession. And what you find is, let me just find this. I wanted to show you this, to share once again my screen, because I'll share this with you. Okay. There we go. So hopefully you can see that. So this is a very beautiful little picture. It comes from quite early on in about the 12th century, but it gives us a beautiful idea about the schematics that were created to help priests in their in hearing a penitent's confession, but also in helping penitents to actually be able to name and know what they were doing. So right at the bottom, you will have the little person, that's Babylon, but also that is the pride. Pride is the root of vice. And then off of that comes all the branches which show the 7 deadly sins. At the top, okay, so you've got 6 of them, and then they have different species, as is known, sub-vices. And you'll see there are 6, but right at the very top, there's a person who's crossing their arms, and that is luxury. So many things would come out of luxury. So it'd be like fornication and avarice and lust, and all those kind of things would come out of luxury. If you have a closer look at this, you'll see winding around is a serpent, which reminds us once more of the Garden of Eden and how Eve fell through listening to the serpent who said, of course, if you eat the apple, you'll be like gods, which is that whole idea of placing God with yourself in a kind of, so making yourself gods. And you'll see two beautiful little winged people, well, not people, but animals, and they're wyverns. And wyverns were known as the heralds of disaster. There are a few of those wyverns in the miracle windows here at Canterbury Cathedral, and they sort of hover over people who have supposedly been healed, but they'll just go back and commit all the same sins again. So this is a lovely pictorial way of what was going on at that time, which was to try and help people confess their sins. But it also puts, as I say, so much onus on the person who was confessing, that in many cases this was becoming a bit of a problem. So by the 14th century, let me just stop sharing. So by the 14th century, this had become the norm, but also we find that a number of texts are beginning to reveal that it's becoming quite a burden for particularly devout people who want to get it right. And so becoming very scrupulous about how they confess their sins, the self-reflection becoming a kind of a dread. It's no longer being seen as a good thing, but actually a denigration of self. So it's really becoming quite a problem. And you see this in Julian as well, but also people like William Fleet, where they start talking about, I have this dread, this lingering dread that even after I've been to confession, I've done everything I possibly can, haven't done enough, that actually I do not get that sense of forgiveness. So I say all this because I think it really shows what's lying behind these chapters that we're talking about, is that Hilton is being a good confessional priest, and he's translating all of that sort of pastoral theology into a wonderful handbook, in a sense, for lay folk, but for contemplatives alike, so that they can do that self-reflection that they need to do to be able to go, that they need to do to be able then to make a full and good and true confession, shifting it away from the confessional forum to when they're on their own and looking once more in the heart. And he's saying that all of this begins by looking inwards, but having the name of Jesus, holding on to the name of Jesus, but that you can't actually see that shadow of Christ within the soul unless you internally deal with a lot of this stuff. And I just hope that this resonates with your own experiences of the spiritual life, because when I read it, I have to say, I go, oh yeah, I know what he's talking about. Oh yeah, I know that. And I've often found it incredibly helpful. So I've got some questions for you to look at once again, and then I'll put you into breakout groups. And hopefully the questions will be a starting block to be able to talk. Yes, that's absolutely right, Andrea. Yeah, that was Martin Luther's problem, always feeling he was never able to confess enough. Yeah, spot on, really spot on. And one of the issues that came out of that came out of this medieval period and moved into the whole rethinking of then how do we confess? What is our relationship with God? What are these barriers? What are these things that we have to, we have to these stages that we have to actually get to be able then to receive that sense of God's forgiveness. Whereas actually it's probably there right from the beginning. Well, we know it is. So let me just stop recording there.